I'd like to get this evening started by first welcoming everyone to our presentation tonight about how to support your grieving child. My name is Katie Boggs, and I am co-chair of the Mental Health Initiative Committee, which is a part of the PTSO at Myers Park High School. I am the parent of both a senior and a freshman at Myers Park, and I am also a licensed psychologist working with kids and families in the Charlotte area. I'm excited about our speaker tonight, and I will let my co-chair Kylie introduce herself and then introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Katie. So I'm Kylie Thiel, the co-chair of the committee, and I have been practicing as a licensed mental health counselor in the Charlotte area since 2002, and I am the parent of a freshman at Myers Park, and I also have a sixth grader at Sedgefield Middle. For those of you who do not know, KinderMourn is a local nonprofit, standalone nonprofit grief agency in the Charlotte area, and KinderMourn has been serving grieving families since 1978. KinderMourn originally began when a mother experienced the death of pregnancy loss and started talking to people and realized that no one was really talking about the loss. And so she started a support group with other mothers and fathers in the basement of a church. From that time, the support has expanded and now includes grieving parents, Empty Arms, which is the pregnancy support, and then the program for children and teens, which Kayla is the coordinator of, for grieving children and teens ages 3-ish until young adult. And there is also a support group that is organized in an outreach program by someone else at KinderMourn where the groups go into the school. So there are a lot of grief things happening and support opportunities through KinderMourn. Our speaker tonight from KinderMourn is Kayla O'Donnell, and Kayla is a Charlotte native. She was born and raised in the South Charlotte area, eventually making her way to UNC Chapel Hill for undergrad. After graduating from Chapel Hill with a double major in sociology and global studies, she worked in corporate retail before realizing her true passion lay in walking alongside people impacted by grief and various mental health struggles. Kayla's first experience with grief was when her mom died at the age of 6, so she has a special place in her heart for bereaved children and teens. As she came to this realization, she went back to graduate school to get her master's in social work with a focus on clinical practice. She has a background in working alongside high school students impacted by homelessness, as well as survivors of sexual assault. She started doing contract work for KinderMourn in 2019 before taking on a full-time position in March of 2020. Her experience at KinderMourn so far has been a whirlwind, starting full-time grief work as a global pandemic took over, but her cup is filled by the work she gets to do alongside children, teens, young adults, and their grieving families every day. Kayla, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kylie, for giving me the beautiful intro. So I'm going to share my screen real quick for the presentation. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's on the call today. This evening, I realized, I don't know about you guys, but I've been struggling with daylight savings and it getting darker so much earlier. So I appreciate you joining in when it's 7:30 and already feels like 10 o'clock. So thank you for that. So today is really all about talking how we support grieving children. And a lot of what I'm going to talk through with you guys today may seem simple or maybe like common knowledge, but when we're amidst grief in our families and different communities we're a part of, it's really hard to keep these things top of mind. So I'm here to kind of go through that with you. I welcome any questions you all have. I think Kylie and Katie are going to help me kind of navigate any that come through while I'm talking, because I'm realizing as I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see those that come through. So, and then I'll definitely have time at the end to answer any questions you all may have. And I'll also have my information at the end in case you guys want to reach out to me directly if you're in need of any resources. So I felt like first it was important just to define grief. I think grief can look a lot different for every person, but how we typically define it at KinderMourn is all the thoughts, feelings, and emotions a person experiences after the loss of something or someone. And the primary loss we work with when we're working alongside kids and teens at KinderMourn is the death of a loved one, or just anyone special in a person's life. But I feel like amidst the pandemic and starting grief work in the pandemic, I'm very much aware that there are other forms of loss that are impacting all of us right now. So you can see, and I'm not going to read word for word from the slides, but you can see that I have, tangible loss and then ambiguous loss listed. So tangible loss is that typical kind of loss that's more straightforward that we think of when it's the death of someone, or even the death of a pet. But when we think about ambiguous loss, that's definitely become very prevalent for us during the pandemic, because it's really in that gray area of life, right? And so it's that lack of certainty that things are going to return back to normal. And I think a lot of us have maybe been talking about, a quote unquote new normal, but what does that even really mean? And so ambiguous loss is a lot less straightforward than our kind of typical losses that we talk about. And so everyone that's on this call tonight has definitely experienced ambiguous loss with the pandemic. But it can also look like things, supporting a loved one who's struggling with substance use, a person in your family, who's been deployed in the military. It can also look like supporting, a loved one who has dementia, and is losing, cognitive functioning and aspects of their personality that you're used to. So ambiguous loss is also very much prevalent. So although at KinderMourn, the grief that we talk about is very much related to the death of a person, grief expands like beyond that because there's all kinds of forms of loss. And I put on here just to remember that grief is very much fluid and it ebbs and flows over time, and it really doesn't have an ending. And so when I'm working with kids and teens, we talk a lot about, grief being a lifelong journey, and it's not something that, necessarily has an end.
Kayla?
Yeah.
Some of the participants aren't able to see the screen.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's, sorry to stop you.
That's okay. Okay, I don't know why. Do we want to try having the host share it and see if that helps?
Yes, let us try to share our screen, and just if everyone can just be patient for a second, let's try that.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and see if that helps. There's always something with Zoom.
Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah, of course.
Why is it not working? Oh, sharing is pause. Maybe stop. Let's try one more time. There you go. Behind here. Shoot. I wonder if because she's in it, we can't get in it.
That shouldn't, you should be able to get into it. Another option is I could share the link in the Q&A so people can pull it up on their screens, just to have. Let me.
Kayla, do you mind just talking for a second while I try to pull it back up, okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Okay, bear with us. Okay, so, thinking through, why is naming our grief and loss important? So I just kind of gave some broad definitions of grief, but it's important to name grief and loss and what we're experiencing, because it gives us a sense of power in kind of naming what's going on, right? So I think a lot of times when it comes to harder emotions or harder experiences in life, like the death of a loved one or someone special in our lives, or just feeling grief over, living through a global pandemic, sometimes we don't want to name these things because we feel like maybe that's going to, okay, I think it's working, maybe. Okay, can everyone see? Or maybe someone just give us like a yes in the Q&A. Okay, we're just gonna go with it. But you'll see I've included, awesome, thank you, Karen. We've included this quote here, and it says, naming and owning hard things doesn't give them power, it gives us power. Brene Brown is also a social worker, and she's done a lot of work around vulnerability. She's written many books. She has a Netflix special, so I'm sure many of you all are familiar with her at this point. But I love this quote from her because I think, you know, a lot of times we avoid talking about hard things or naming hard feelings because we're afraid that then maybe that gives it some sort of power. And maybe it'll become all consuming, but a lot of times it's when we're not naming these things and not talking about it or avoiding the hard conversations that they gain more power and can kind of fester, and they come up in other ways. So you guys can go ahead and click to the next slide. If possible. Thank you. I also want to touch a little bit on developmental stages in grief. This is specific for teens, so I have other resources for you all if anyone needs kind of resources around other age stages of life for kids. But I figured teens would be most prevalent and pertinent for this conversation since it is high schoolers and high school parents that are on the call. And so number one, I just want to remind everyone, grief is not a monolith. So there's not, you know, an all-encompassing list that we can kind of have of different typical responses. These are just the ones that we find are most typical or most common when we're working with teens. And I think it's also important to recognize that for teenagers, especially, they're in that developmental stage of life where they're very much seeking their independence from parents and caregivers. They are really figuring out their identity. They're forming more secure attachments to, you know, their friends and peers. And so you'll see in this list of kind of those initial responses that a lot of that is them kind of trying to deny how they're feeling or maybe not sharing as much with you all. And so I think it's important to recognize that part of that is, you know, due to the developmental stage that they're in, but also especially for teenagers, but really kids of all ages. I think a lot of the times they are looking to actually protect, you know, their parents and caregivers and adults around them. And they feel like they need to, quote unquote, deal with their grief and what they're going through on their own because they don't want to then put that on you all. So hopefully you can kind of see the list of the initial responses, but I'll just read them real quick just in case anyone's still having trouble with seeing. But that first one just says they may try to act as if nothing has happened and try hiding their feelings. They can deny that they need help or support. They may demonstrate anger or guilt because weirdly enough, these feelings I think are easier to express necessarily than sadness. And because a lot of times they maybe are denying or not sharing these emotions, we'll more so often see them physically in kids and teens. So that can look like, you know, grades going down, changes in social behaviors. Maybe they're isolating themselves more or they're not around as much. It can be, you know, not sleeping as much or sleeping more so than they used to. So definitely looking out for signs and symptoms that are physical, just knowing that they're not always going to verbally express that. So we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Thank you. And so this goes into kind of more just expressions that you may see of grief by teenagers. Some of these I already talked about, you know, as far as the sleeplessness or oversleeping, you know, lack of appetite or increased appetite is on there too. Existential questioning is a big one as well. So wondering, why does that happen? Could I have prevented it? Why do good people die? What happens after a person died? So really questioning a lot of these things and what it may look like if someone else close to them dies, or what happens if I die? And what does that look like? So a lot of questioning around these things that, you know, don't necessarily have answers, right? And that's really hard as adults to not feel like we have clear answers and support for kids. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. I also did want to touch on complicated grief. Again, I think it's prevalent because we are living in a time where there's layers to our grief. So, working alongside a lot of kids right now who have experienced the death of a loved one, but then are also navigating a global pandemic where we're hearing about death and dying all day, every day, in the news, on social media. There's this fear of COVID. We're wearing masks at school, masks in grocery stores. And so there's also this kind of fear that's encompassing us around the pandemic that we're navigating. And I've never navigated a global pandemic before. None of us have, right? The last one was over 100 years ago. So I think recognizing that complicated grief may be more prevalent right now just because there's so many layers to what's been going on. And even thinking about, losing a loved one in the middle of a pandemic, maybe not being able to have a funeral or memorial service for them, or not being able to say goodbye in person. I've worked with many kids who didn't get to go to the hospital when their loved one got sick because of restrictions due to COVID, or were saying goodbye over FaceTime. So this really does kind of complicate things, right? And so I wanted to touch on complicated grief because that may be something that you all are seeing in your kids. And it's not to scare you. It just means that maybe they need, extra support and help, because complicated grief is actually considered a diagnosis now. So it's called persistent complex bereavement disorder. And that's a lot of fancy words just to mean that, you're really in an ongoing heightened state of mourning. So, grief is a lifelong journey, but if we're noticing that people are having emotions and symptoms of grief, like the ones that we kind of discussed a couple of slides ago, where it's really impacting like their everyday life and ability to go back to school or normal functioning for months on end, then that's when we really want to make sure that we're getting, them mental health and professional support, but not just for complicated grief, really for all grief. We want to normalize getting them support, but I wanted to make sure to touch on that with you guys. I'm not going to read through all the signs and symptoms. I can definitely make sure to send this out to you all afterwards so that you have access to these slides, but there's a lot of different things to look out for in that. You guys can go ahead and go to the next slide. So all that to say, we talked about grief, signs and symptoms, what it can look like. So how do we support grieving kids? And that's, I think, why a lot of you all are here on this call. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. The first thing is to take care of you. And some of you may be like, what? And I work with a lot of parents who they're coming in, they very much want support for their kids. And one of the first things I'll ask them is, do you have your own form of support? And they kind of look at me like, well, that doesn't really matter right now, right? Like, I just want to get help for my kid. And actually very much does matter. I'm sure most of you have experienced flying on an airplane. And so in the mental health profession, we use this analogy a lot, of the airplane analogy. And when they talk about, if something were to happen and those masks come down to help you breathe, hopefully that doesn't happen to any of us, but if they do, they always say, put your mask on first before you put it on, a child next to you. And that may feel weird and counterintuitive, but we talk about that being just as important and using that as an analogy when it comes to supporting your kids. Because kids really look to the adults around them as far as like role models and examples for what is and isn't okay. And that includes, reaching out for support, talking about our feelings, normalizing therapy, normalizing support outside of our families. And so, I included just a couple of things on here, which is basically just like kids will mimic us. And so if you are doing things to take care of yourself, kids will see that that's something normal. And, oh, we do that. My mom does that, or my dad does that, or grandparents who have her. And we want to make sure that they see that within you. So first and foremost, I hope that you all are taking care of yourselves and sourcing support through the different communities that you're a part of, because that is just as important to your kids as it is to you. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. Next is being honest. So I don't know, the nature of why everyone's on this call, but anytime something happens, whether it's a death in the family, a death outside of the family, something tragic, it's really important to be honest with kids about what happened, and using direct language, that is age appropriate to do so. We see a lot of caregivers who struggle with being honest about, how someone died or what exactly happened because they're looking to protect or shield their child from that information. And ultimately it can lead to, a lack of trust with the kid down the road, because kids are really intuitive, number one. Two, they pick up on things. And so they're listening in on conversations that you don't realize they are. If you're on the phone with someone, if you're in another room, they watch even your body language. So if there's something more going on than you're being honest with them about, that's going to be really hard for them, to understand if they find out later and feel like you weren't fully honest with them. So as hard as it can be, to have these conversations, it's so, so important to be honest with your kids, because then they know that you are a safe person to go to, right? You're a safe person to go to because you're being honest with them, and they feel like they can be honest with you about what's going on with them when they're experiencing, some of these harder feelings, or if there's something going on at school or something going on within their friend group and they want to be able to come to you about it, but they don't know how you're going to respond. So if you kind of set the tone of keeping things from them, that's going to be really hard. So definitely being honest is super important. And also, this is listed on here too, if they have questions that you don't know the answer to, it's okay to say, I don't know. Or it's okay to say, yeah, I struggle with that question too, and I don't have the answers, right? So I think sometimes as adults, we want to have all the answers for kids, and we want to be able to give them, a sense of relief. But there are certain questions where we don't have the answers. And I know for me as an adult, it's still hard to wrap my head around death and dying and what that means, and, our own mortality and all the things that are happening in the world. And so it's okay to be honest with kids that you struggle with this stuff too, because you're not supposed to be, a superhero. You're human just like them. And so it's really helpful for them to know, that you struggle with things too, or you don't have all the answers. And I put on here, you can always look up questions together. I have kids all the time who ask me questions that are super random, and I'm not going to make something up. I'll tell them, I don't know, but what if we look it up together, and we'll pull out my phone, or we'll go on the computer and we'll Google things together. So I definitely encourage you all to do that too. And I think just most importantly, they need and deserve to know the truth, and to know it from someone that they love and trust, and who also loves and trusts them. So, and I also put on here, there can be situations where we don't have all the answers and we're not sure, but as we find out more information, just being honest with kids along the way too, and not hiding things from them. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so then this slide just talks about listening, observing, acknowledging, and normalizing. So for listening, observing, I think once you are honest with your kids, or once everyone's kind of aware of what has happened, it's important to listen to them. And so to give them that space to come to you and share about what's going on, checking in around their thoughts and feelings about what happened. Now, I also spoke about for teenagers, it's incredibly difficult sometimes to get information from them, and they may not be as willing and open to sharing. So I think that's where kind of the observation comes in, of noticing any of those behavioral changes, noticing that something different is going on, and asking them about it, but not in a way that puts pressure on them, but just in a way that's curious, right? I've really loved watching Ted Lasso. It's been my show that has brought me a lot of joy throughout the pandemic. And one of the things from the show that I love and think about all the time is be curious, not judgmental, right? And so there is no one way to feel your grief, experience it. There's no such thing as good or bad feelings. So we want to make sure that we're just being curious, and we're not seeking to judge them if there are some major changes that we're noticing in their behavior, and just looking to seek and support them, and point it out in a gentle and loving way. And I also put in here just kind of avoiding rushing in with explanations and advice, because you can't fix grief. There is no fix for it, right? There's no cure for it. So you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to explain things away, and just listening and observing can do a lot for kids. And then the second part of this is acknowledging and normalizing. So as you're listening to them and they're sharing different things over time, acknowledging those feelings. And also, again, reinforcing that there's no such thing as good or bad or positive or negative feelings. I tell kids all the time, like, feelings are called feelings because we're supposed to feel them, which may sound silly, but, anger and frustration and jealousy and grief and sadness and fear, these harder, feelings that we have are just as important to normalize and to express and give kids outlets to express as, the feelings of joy and the feelings, of happiness and excitement, because, we're meant to feel all of the feelings and we're not meant to numb any of those feelings out. Because if you're numbing a certain feeling like sadness or anger, that means that you're also not going to be able to feel the full impact of joy and excitement, because you can't, selectively numb feelings. So that's why it's so important to just normalize for kids when they are feeling angry or upset, and to not, kind of do maybe our go-to, which is like, oh, don't be upset, don't cry, right? Let them cry, let them be upset, even if it's uncomfortable. And I think too, once again, kids look to you all as what is and isn't okay as far as feeling your feelings. So they're looking to adults as role models. So if you are one that, shields your tears or doesn't want to cry in front of your kids, I understand if you don't want to go, full blown into, sobbing for hours in front of them, but it is important for them to see you cry and to know that that's okay. Because then that gives them, a sense of safety that they can do that around you too. So, again, they're really looking to us as far as knowing what is and isn't okay and what's safe and not safe for us. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, next is sharing and reassuring. So again, there's no cure for grief. There's no such thing. But when we share our stories with each other and we're witnessing each other in our pain, that can provide some relief and understanding. So one, encouraging your kids to share things with you, but also you telling your kids stories about your life and the things that you've been through in different times when you felt, afraid or sad or angry. And what did you do to navigate these situations? And maybe there are things that people said to you that were unhelpful at the time, and what you wish they would have said to you. So just normalizing the full spectrum of being a human being, which means that even as parents, we're going to have gone through hard stuff too. And so sharing that with your children is really, really important, because again, it normalizes their experience. And I think as well for kids is encouraging them to express, any fears and fantasies they have, and to know that death is something that we all think about and that we all maybe wrestle with and are fearful of at different times. And so they know that they're not alone in that, and really giving them the space to express that to you, and not, trying to brush certain things like that under the rug. And the last thing just talks about for kids, sometimes after a death happens, they feel like maybe if they had done something differently, or if they had said something or not said something, that would change things. And so, just really reassuring them that, we're not in power control over the death, of other people, and these huge significant things like a global pandemic happening. And so letting them know that it is not their fault, and reassuring that to them over and over and over again, that it's not anything they did or anything they said or didn't say or didn't do that caused the death of a loved one. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. Encouraging various forms of expression. So this one's important because not everyone tends to express verbally, or that may not be like their preferred way of expression, right? And so, if you have kids who maybe they're just not big talkers, we don't want to force anyone into talking either, but we do want to encourage other outlets of expression. So whether that is through the arts like drawing or crafting or writing, or listening to music, or sports, playing games together, whatever it may be. This is all just as important as talking, right? And so even if it's sharing different music with each other, right, that reminds you of a loved one who's died, all of these things are really meaningful. And so knowing, again, that there's no one quote unquote right way of expressing, and making sure kids know that too. And if you're someone that's maybe more of an internal processor and you're not as big on externally expressing, sharing that with your kids, and then also sharing ways that help you, right? And then also giving kids permission that they don't have to grieve all the time. So I think sometimes we feel like by grieving, we're keeping that connection to the person who has died, strong, and that if we're no longer grieving, that means that we don't care, we didn't, love them as much. And that's just not true, right? So again, we're full spectrum human beings. We're not meant to grieve or feel one thing all the time. And so giving them the permission to do that. And that may sound silly, but I know even as an adult, sometimes, I'll call like a close friend or family member and ask for permission, right, to opt out of something or to feel a certain feeling, or to express in a certain way. And it does feel good to be given the permission to do that. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I think, oh wait, yes, that's right. Okay. So the paradox of grief. Well, with death and loss, it really challenges our understanding and view of the world, right? This makes things really hard, and we may want to completely disconnect from everyone and everything. But it's really in our grief that we need connection, and we need a sense of groundedness, which can come a lot of times in our routine. So it is a balance though, right? Because we want to be mindful of not just expecting kids to go on with everyday life as if nothing has happened, right? But definitely still having a sense of routine for them, and having that structure and predictability is really important, because death and grief completely throws that. So maintaining those family routines and habits as much as you can, because they know that they'll have a sense of security in that, right? And so, but we do want to be like mindful that it's also okay, like, I'll have certain kids who miss some days of school and things like that, and that's more than okay. It's just kind of balancing that and talking about it as a family. And I also put a note on here, like, if you're thinking of making changes to family routines in an effort to help, or in an effort to, be like, oh, I don't want to, have as high of expectations right now because there's so much going on, talk to your kids about that. Because for some of them, maybe having those expectations and routines would be helpful, right? Maybe they still want to go to dance practice or football practice. Maybe they do still want to be involved in things after school and they don't want to break from that. So just making sure that any changes that you're making, that you're doing it, in a partnership with your kids, and that you're not just making decisions for them, and really asking them what they need to. All right, now you can go to the next slide. This one talks about, rituals in new family traditions. So I feel like this is especially prevalent, with the holidays coming up. This can be a particularly hard time of year, whether it's, your first holiday season without a loved one here, or it's been 20 years, it can still be incredibly difficult. And so talking about, traditions that you've had as a family in and around the holidays, or in and around like important events, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, different things like that. Talking with your kids about, are there any new, rituals and traditions that you want to try to honor, the memory of your loved one. And I think it can be cool to incorporate, various aspects of your family's culture, or lineage, or faith, or spirituality into that. Because it's a cool way for kids to, kind of learn more about your family history. But again, talking with them about this, and I put a note on here, not assuming that kids necessarily want new rituals or traditions, because I think sometimes, especially in that first, holiday season without our loved one here, we may think like, oh, we're not going to do this anymore because, this person, that was kind of their thing, or maybe it was something that they always baked or cooked, and so we're just not going to eat that. you know, maybe that's something that the kids want to bake or cook together, and that would be meaningful for them. Or it's like, no, this is too hard, we're just going to order pizza, and that's totally okay. But definitely just talking to the kids about this for sure. Next slide. Okay, this one says to be patient. So, you know, I've talked a lot about grief kind of ebbing and flowing, it being a lifelong journey. So just remembering that it's ever changing, and that can mean within a given day. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, your child can be feeling one way, and by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock that day, you know, they're in a totally different headspace. So just knowing that, you know, it's not on a timeline. There is no like a one fix all. There's no such thing as getting over the death of a loved one, because grief really becomes just a part of our life. And that's not to, you know, scare us. It's just kind of the reality of when you had a significant loss in your life. Of course, it's going to get interwoven into the fabric of your being. And so we just want to make sure that we're patient with kids, because it is a process. And especially, you know, kind of going back to the different developmental stages of kids, grief can look different within each stage, and kids can also re-grieve, and it's as if they're experiencing a, you know, a new loss all over again. So really just being patient with that, and, you know, again, normalizing for kids and talking with them about it, you know, and not using language like, well, once you get over this, right? Because there is no getting over it. It's, you know, really, how do we move forward? What does that look like? Okay. And then I think the last one, kind of going off of that, this is a quote that really means a lot to me. So I wanted to share with you guys, and it just says, some things cannot be fixed, they can only be carried. And so I'll hear different families and even kids I work with talking about moving on or getting over. And with me, grief really does become something that we carry, right? And we learn how to carry it with us and what that looks like. And some days it's going to be heavier than others. And just reminding ourselves that there is no fix for it. And that may be scary, but it's okay. Like, as we, you know, navigate life, we're going to learn how to carry it differently. And there may be some seasons of life where we carry it easier than others. And that's more than okay. So just wanted to end on that and kind of open it up to questions if anyone has any.
Kayla, there are a couple in the chat, the
Okay.
question and answer. Can you see those? Do you want Katie or I to read them too?
Yes, I think, yes, I do see some in the chat. So the first one I think I can see is, can you speak at all to the ways in which an untimely death, in particular the suicide of a friend, can affect a teen? So this, you know, goes into like tragic loss, sudden loss, which is really difficult. And I've been supporting a lot of kids alongside, you know, death by suicide. Unfortunately, it's becoming more and more prevalent. And we see that, you know, especially when, you know, the world is going through a pandemic and we're seeing spikes in that. You know, and that can affect kids in a lot of different ways. You know, all the different things that we kind of spoke about in the presentation, but again, it looks different for every teen. And so I have specific resources around, you know, suicide that I'm more than happy to send out, and you can email me, you know, but I think it looks different for every kid, and it's incredibly scary. And I know as parents, it's really hard, because I think we avoid wanting to talk about that as well, out of this fear that we're going to, quote unquote, normalize suicide, and then that's going to lead to other kids experiencing suicidal ideation. But there's no research to support that. If anything, the research supports that we need to talk about it. And it's a really hard thing to talk about, you know, as parents and as families. But letting kids ask those questions and letting your kids have those hard conversations, and, you know, doing it with them is really, really important. Okay. So it looks like a question kind of around, you know, kids being excited about Christmas, but maybe you as the parent are not. and wanting, you know, your child to understand that you're having a hard time, but also not wanting to minimize their happiness. And so what do you do with that? So that's a really good question. And I've actually had a lot of, you know, parents kind of share that with me, and some teenagers that I just saw yesterday that were talking about how, you know, their mom basically is like, I'm not doing anything for Thanksgiving, like I'm not cooking, but you guys can kind of celebrate in whatever way feels good to you. And so again, it's just having that really open, honest conversation with your child, and normalizing that it's more than okay for her to be happy and excited about the holidays and to want to celebrate, but also letting her know and being honest that you're not in a place where you want to celebrate right now. Right. And so figuring out together, what does that look like? Is there someone she can spend that holiday with, that she can celebrate more comfortably with? Does that mean, you know, that you kind of take space away and you let her know that you need that space away, that has nothing to do with her, and that you don't, you know, want her to feel any less happy or excited? So it really does come down to just having those open, honest conversations and coming up with a plan together, right? So maybe she wants to go and spend some time with friends on that day, or go spend time with, you know, another family member. But normalizing for kids too, that maybe they're going to have a mixture of feelings. They may be really excited and happy about the holidays, but then as that day comes closer to, they may feel more sad or confused or weird, and just knowing that, you know, that's normal and it's okay and oh so natural. But I think just, you know, really letting her know that she's more than allowed to be excited and happy about the upcoming holidays, but that you also get to have your feelings too, and that you're not in a place where you want to celebrate. But that doesn't mean that the two of those things can't coexist together. It's not an either or, right? So I think a lot of times we want to bucket things into like, either we're going to celebrate or we're not. We're going to be happy or we're going to be sad. And it doesn't really work that way. So I think it's finding, how do we exist within the both and how do you make it so that you both get to honor this time of life in a way that feels most comfortable for you. I don't see any other questions. Thank you all for listening. It's weird not to see any faces, but thank you all so much for joining and just being a part of the call. I think I had put on the last slide my email information, but I'm happy just to send that out with the slides to people so that you all have them, because I know it's a lot of information and things that I just talked at you for like 45 minutes. So I'm happy to send that out in that way. If you have any questions or things you want to follow up on, you can always ask. Okay, I'm seeing any local resources you recommend. If it's specific to grief and loss, definitely KinderMourn. But outside of that, I mean, we have a list of referrals. So depending on what you're kind of looking for, whether it's mental health related outside of grief and loss, I'm more than happy to connect any of you all to those resources in the area. How do you get a teen child to engage? That's a great question. And that's really hard. And so, you know, remembering kind of the life stage that they're at, that they just naturally may not want to engage as much. But with any age of a child, I always tell parents to get interested in something that interests them. So talking to them about things that you notice that they're a part of or they like, asking them questions. You know, I think food also helps a lot. So I know that taking, you know, a teen out to asking them like, what restaurant do you want to go to? Like, let's go one-on-one. I think it would be special. Or going and getting ice cream, but having that one-on-one time, I think, can be really special, and making it intentional. It's really hard as we get caught up in like the day-to-day of life. We've all got a lot going on, and I can imagine that you're checking in with your kids, but I think carving out like really intentional time where it's just about you and them, and having that one-on-one time and allowing them to pick the place, right? Giving them that autonomy to pick the restaurant or the place they want to go to, or, going to see a movie together, letting them pick out the movie that you want to watch that night. But just inviting them in some way, getting them involved in something that interests them, which I know food is always an easy one, but other things too.
Kayla, could you talk about when you feel like a professional should get involved? How do parents know, like, when they need to get professional help versus just working with their kid themselves and making sure they're communicating and stuff?
Yeah. So I think there's like multiple answers to that. I would say that it's never too soon to get a child involved with like counseling or some sort of support group. Because I think a lot of the times when we get kids involved in counseling is when there is like a crisis going on or something awful has happened, which is important for sure. But I think even just having them try it out just because, and normalizing that we all need other outlets of support, and that having that time and really speaking to like the confidentiality piece, which I know a lot of teens really like when they're coming to therapy, which is knowing that, I'm not here to go and tell mom or dad or whoever their caregiver is everything that they're talking to me about. Like, this space is really meant for them to share what's going on, what's on their mind. And so obviously with caveats to that, if we're worried about health and safety, but one, knowing that it's never too soon, or it's, you don't have to wait until something awful or tragic happens. And then two, also looking out for some of those signs and symptoms of like physical distress. So if you're seeing that a child is struggling with sleep, whether it's oversleeping or lack of sleep or waking up a lot in the middle of the night, when you're really seeing things that are taking hold like physically, whether it's like headaches, stomach aches, a lot of that is just a physical manifestation of something that's going on, internally or mental health wise. And so that's where, kind of really picking up on any behavioral changes or notices that you're seeing is really important. And that's when you first, it's always helpful, one, to go to like a GP or pediatrician with the kids. But it's, also knowing that mental health support is very much connected to our physical health because the two are in tandem with each other. And so definitely if you're noticing any major changes like that, for sure. I see a question about like if your child isn't sleeping and how do you help? One, I'm not a doctor, so this is not like medical advice, but there's a lot of different things to try as far as, even something as simple as like a weighted blanket or noise machines, melatonin. I know a lot of kids will take that can help, which is like an over-the-counter supplement that you can try. But I think it's also wanting to get to the root of like, why are they not sleeping, right? So asking them like, hey, what's going on? Is there something that's keeping you up at night? Like, are you anxious? Are you having nightmares? Like, what's going on? So not necessarily jumping to the fix first, but really seeking to ask them like, hey, like, is there a reason you're not sleeping? And maybe there's something that's on their mind or something they're really anxious about that they just haven't shared yet. And getting kind of to the root of that first. That obviously sleep is really important. So we definitely want to find different ways to help them sleep. And that's something where I would also get a medical professional involved.
Kayla, there was also a question about the difference between just normal teenage angst, to kind of just use that to describe it, and cries for help, or times where you feel like the difference. What's normal? What might that look like? And how would someone be able to tell the difference between that and a teenager?
Yeah, that's hard because it can look pretty similar. But I think, again, that comes into like one, asking questions. Right. So asking questions and checking in with them every day. So, I've worked a lot with parents about like intentional check-ins, not just asking like, how's your day at school? Because they're probably going to say fine and then go to the room, shut the door. Right. So asking questions beyond that, because you're probably not going to get an answer. And so one, talking to them, asking to really learn more about what's going on in their day to day. And then again, if you're noticing changes, just gently pointing that out of like, hey, I noticed that, you haven't been hanging out with so-and-so as much, or, that you're in your room a little bit more, like, is there anything going on? Did something happen? And so, just letting them know that you notice, because I think with teens, a lot of times they think no one cares, no one's noticing me, I'm going through all these things and these feelings. And so letting them know that like you're here and you're there, and just asking questions. And I know it's really hard to get them to talk sometimes, but one of my favorite things to have kids do with parents every day is sharing like a high, low, and a glow of the day. And so a high is just anything, it can be super small, exciting or good that happened at school. Maybe it's something that they're looking forward to if they have no high for the day. And then a low is, obviously something that's not so great that happened, or something that annoyed or frustrated them or made them angry. And then a glow is like a little, celebration about themselves. So I call it also a brag, but I think sometimes people get weird about bragging. But it's really important to celebrate, ourselves and our kids. And so asking them and checking in with them every single day with, things like that outside of just like, how are you? How was school? Because a lot of times you're just going to get, one word answers to that. And also knowing that maybe they're not going to open up to you right away as you start trying to ask these questions. And so, but giving it time and giving them time to continue to open up and continuing to ask questions, even if they aren't opening up. So, but I get that it's very hard to discern between normal teenage angst versus, something bigger that may be going on. And so also knowing that if you're not someone that your kids feel, comfortable going to about that stuff, suggesting that they call someone or get in touch with someone who is, whether it's an older sibling or an aunt or an uncle, a family friend, someone at school, just things like that. Because you also don't have to be the one that knows everything that's going on, but you just want to make sure that your kids have that, sense of support and community outside of you, because you're also not supposed to be all the things to your kids, right? And so they need to have that full like community of support. And so what does that look like for them, if it's not you? Any other questions?
Kayla, just real quickly, are there a question about like, are there kids who process kind of death okay on their own, where they, they seem fine, they're continuing with their life, they're going out with friends, they're doing okay in school, but they've never really processed it with you as a parent, and you don't know that they're talking to anybody else about it. As a parent, do you have to be worried about that? Like, oh my gosh, they need to be processing this with somebody, they need to be talking about it? Or is that sometimes okay are there times when kids are just like, they seem to be, they've somehow worked it out themselves and handled it okay?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that kind of goes back to like, what are kids' different outlets of expression? And so some kids are very much, maybe they're a big journaler and they get a lot out in that, and they don't necessarily need another physical human to, talk and process through things with. So no, there's not. Basically at KinderMourn, when we have, kids come to us, a lot of times it is because like the parent is concerned, right? And we'll have kids come to us and maybe, they're like, I'm good. Like my mom wants me to be here, but like, I really don't want to be here. Right. And I feel like I'm doing okay on my own. And, we talk about, okay, well, what are your outlets of, support, and how do you take care of yourself and things like that? And knowing that like, we don't also want to force support onto kids or force things like counseling. If it's just not going to be beneficial for them, or if it's not the right time. I think it's like towing the line of wanting to normalize support in that way and normalize therapy, but also saying, hey, if you give it this, if you give it, 1 or 2 sessions and it's just not for you, knowing that like, I'm not going to force you into going, right? Because if we force kids into doing something, then it's going to have a very much a negative connotation or association. And then when they're in their 20s and 30s and later on in life, and maybe something does happen and they're really struggling, they have this really kind of not so great experience with counseling, and they're probably not going to seek it out, right? Or they're going to be a lot more averse to, or have very much a wall up around it, because it's like, oh, well, I tried it that one time because my mom forced me and it was terrible. I'm never going back again, right? So I think it's encouraging kids to be open to trying something like that. If you see that they're really struggling, right? Or if if something awful has happened and you just want them to have a check-in with someone, and then going from there. So really taking it one session at a time. But yes, there are definitely kids who, are able to kind of process through their grief and move through it in a way where they don't need therapy and counseling, right? Maybe they're big into sports or movement or journaling or art or whatever it may be. And that's been a very healthy, or they've been healthy outlets of support for them. And so we don't want to force what we think is best upon them, right? So we want to, honor that, maybe they figured it out, for themselves at this time being, but also letting them know if that changes, or you want to try counseling, if that's something that you're going to support them in. Any other questions?
Kayla, if someone needed KinderMourn support and were interested in learning more about how to make that happen for their child or themselves, or passing that on, what would be the best way to go about that?
Either emailing me or just calling our main number. So I can, I don't know, I don't think in the Q&A there's really a way to mass give out a email, because it looks like you kind of just answer each question, which is weird. But I can have, them send out my email as well as our main phone number. So yeah, just either sending me a quick email, if there's any resources or anything you're needing, or you have further questions about, or just giving us a call. There's no formal referral process.
I think we have about 1 more minute. If there are any other questions that anyone has, they want to pop into the Q&A. Thank you so much, Kayla, for taking time late on a Tuesday night to speak to everyone and share more about grief, and for being open to responding to emails and phone calls, and for KinderMourn and yourself as well. We're very, very grateful for you, and also for everyone who joined and came. And if you all have any additional questions or need to contact, we'll make sure that we get that information out to you however we're able to.
And Kylie, oh, sorry, one last message. I believe that we will have a recorded session of this on Mustang Madness, or available on PTSO. I'm not quite sure where it'll be available, but so if there are people that attendees know who want to listen to this, it will be available as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.